The first thing she noticed was the silence. Not the quiet of their penthouse overlooking the Han River, a thick, velvet silence bought and paid for. This was different. This was the thin, sterile silence of a hospital, punctuated by the rhythmic, indifferent beep of a machine. It was a sound that scraped against her nerves, a constant reminder of the shattered glass and twisted metal that had brought them here. Zora sat in a hard plastic chair, her fingers knotted together in the pocket of her gray hoodie. The hoodie was old, soft from 1,000 washings, a relic from a life before Kwon Ji-hoon. A life where her biggest worry was midterm exams, not rival families or betrayals whispered in hushed tones. Now it was her armor. The only thing in this cold, white room that felt like it belonged to her. For 3 days, he hadn't moved. The man who commanded the soul underworld with a glance, who moved through life with the predatory grace of a panther, was utterly still. His face, usually a mask of carved indifference, was pale against the white pillow. A line of black stitches disappeared into his hairline, a stark mar on his perfect, cruel beauty. She'd spent hours just watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, her own breath hitched in her throat, waiting. Then his eyelids fluttered. Zora was on her feet in an instant, her hand hovering over the call button. His eyes, dark and depthless, finally opened. They scanned the room, the Ford drip, the heart monitor, the window showing a sliver of gray sky, before they landed on her. She waited for the flicker of recognition, the subtle shift in his expression that would tell her he saw her. It never came. His gaze was flat, empty. He looked at her the way one might look at a piece of furniture, a part of the scenery that held no meaning. A cold dread, colder than the air-conditioned room, washed over her. "Ji-hoon," she whispered, her voice rough. He blinked slowly. The name didn't register. He pushed himself up on his elbows, his movements stiff. He looked at his own hands, turning them over as if they were foreign objects. They were beautiful hands, long-fingered and elegant, but she had seen them do terrible things with an artist's precision. Now, they looked lost. "Where am I?" he asked. His voice was the same low baritone, but the authority was gone. It was just a sound, stripped of its power. "The hospital," she said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You were in an accident. A car crash." He looked at her again, a faint furrow appearing between his brows. "And you are?" The question struck her with the force of a physical blow. She felt the air leave her lungs. For 20 months, she had been his wife. A title that was both a shield and a cage. In his world, that name meant everything. It meant she was untouchable. It meant she was his. Now, he looked at her as if she were a stranger who had wandered into his room by mistake. Before she could answer, the door swung open. The doctor, a man whose loyalty Ji-hoon had purchased long ago, entered with a grim expression. Behind him were Ji-hoon's sister, Mina, and his most trusted lieutenant, Park Seo-joon. Mina rushed to the bedside, her perfectly styled hair not moving a single inch. "Brother, you're awake." Her voice was laced with a theatrical panic that made Zora's teeth ache. Ji-hoon flinched from her touch, his eyes darting from Mina's tear-streaked face to Seo-joon's somber one. He looked back at Zora, a flicker of something confusion, maybe appeal, in his empty gaze. The doctor cleared his throat, holding up a chart. "The initial scans are clear of any swelling, but given the trauma to the head, we're seeing signs of significant retrograde amnesia." Seo-joon stepped forward. "Amnesia? What does that mean, exactly?" "It means," the doctor said, his eyes carefully avoiding Zora's, "that Mr. Kwon has no memory of his life before waking up a few moments ago. Not his business, not his family." He paused, his gaze finally flicking to Zora. "Not his wife." The word hung in the air, heavy and poisoned. Mina's carefully constructed grief faltered, replaced by a glint of something sharp and calculating. Zora saw it. She saw the way Mina's eyes met Seo-joon's over the hospital bed, a silent, venomous exchange. An opportunity. They ushered her out of the room moments later, claiming Ji-hoon needed to rest, that they would handle everything. Zora stood in the hallway, the worn fabric of her hoodie bunched in her fists. She felt like a ghost, invisible and irrelevant. She leaned against the cool wall, intending to wait, to reclaim her space. That was when she heard their voices, low and urgent, from just around the corner. "The elders will need to be managed," Seo-jun was saying. "They won't accept this. They will accept what we tell them to accept." Mina's voice was like ice. "He is a child again. He knows nothing. This is our chance to restructure, to correct his mistakes." Zora knew what mistakes Mina was referring to. Her. The young black woman from America Ji-hoon had married without the family's approval, a disruption to their pure-blooded dynasty. "And her?" Seo-jun asked. "The wife. She's a 20-year-old girl in a sweatshirt," Mina scoffed. "She's a nobody. She'll be taken care of. For now, she's useful." A familiar face to keep him calm. Zora pressed herself flatter against the wall, her blood running cold. This was not just a family squabble. This was a coup. They were circling like vultures, ready to pick apart the empire of a man who was lying in a hospital bed, looking at his own hands as if he didn't know what they were capable of. And she was the only one standing in their way. A nobody. A girl in a sweatshirt. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The penthouse felt cavernous without him. When Ji-hoon was home, his presence filled every corner, a silent, simmering energy that demanded the space obey him. Now, bringing him back from the hospital felt like leading a ghost through a museum of his own life. Zora watched as he walked through the enormous living room, his steps hesitant on the polished black marble. He ran a hand over the cool leather of the sofa, his expression unreadable. "This is ours?" he asked, the word sounding foreign on his tongue. "It's yours," Zora corrected gently. "You're home." His dark eyes found hers. "You live here too." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact he seemed to be piecing together. The first few days were a tense ballet of feigned normalcy. She showed him how to use the complicated coffee machine he'd insisted on importing from Italy. She laid out his clothes, simple black sweaters and trousers, a far cry from the razor-sharp Tom Ford suits that usually encased him. He was quiet, observant. He watched her with an unnerving intensity, as if trying to solve a puzzle. The man who never showed a hint of vulnerability was now utterly dependent on her, and the reversal was dizzying. Mina and Seo-jun were constant presences. They brought documents for him to sign, portfolios to review. "Just formalities, brother," Mina would say with a brittle smile. "To keep things running smoothly while you recover." Each time, Ji-hoon would look at the papers, then at Zora. His eyes would ask a question he couldn't voice. And each time, Zora would find a reason to intervene. "The doctor said no stress," she would say, her voice calm as she took the pen from Mina's hand. "He needs to rest. We can look at this later." Her interference was met with thinly veiled contempt. Mina would look at her, at the gray hoodie she still wore like a second skin, and her lip would curl. "You're just his nursemaid now, aren't you? Don't forget your place." Zora never rose to the bait. She met their glares with a quiet resolve that seemed to unnerve them more than any outburst would have. She was the keeper of the king, and they couldn't get to him without going through her. She had made a choice in that hospital hallway. She would not run. She would hold the line. One afternoon, he found her in his study. She was going through his desk, carefully organizing the chaos Mina had tried to create. He stood in the doorway, watching her. He was holding a small, framed photograph she hadn't realized was there. It was of a woman with his eyes, her expression soft and sad. "Who is she?" he asked, his voice low. Zora's heart clenched. She knew the story. It was the one piece of him he'd ever shared with her, late one night when a storm raged outside and the whiskey had loosened his tongue. His mother. She had been betrayed by his own father, cast aside for a younger, more politically advantageous wife. She had died alone, and Ji-hoon, then just a boy, had been unable to protect her. It was the wound he carried, the failure that drove his obsession with absolute loyalty. "That was your mother," Zora said softly. "You loved her very much." He traced the woman's face with his thumb. "Did I protect her?" The question was so raw, so close to the bone of the man he truly was, that it took her breath away. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a deep, ancient pain that memory loss couldn't erase. "You were a child," she said. "You did everything you could." He didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at the photograph. In that moment, he wasn't the amnesiac patient or the ruthless crime lord. He was just a man haunted by a ghost. A ghost he couldn't even name. That night, she heard him cry out in his sleep. She rushed into his bedroom to find him tangled in the sheets, his body rigid, a sheen of sweat on his brow. "No," he muttered, his eyes squeezed shut. "Don't touch her. Don't." Zora sat on the edge of the bed, her hand hesitating before she gently placed it on his shoulder. "Ji-hoon. It's a dream. You're safe." His eyes flew open. He grabbed her wrist, his grip like steel. It was the same strength, the same possessive power she knew so well. For a heartbeat, the vacant look was gone, replaced by a flash of the predator. His gaze was sharp, focused, pinning her in place. He stared at her, his chest rising and falling rapidly, the silence in the room electric. Then, as quickly as it came, the look was gone. The confusion returned. He loosened his grip, his eyes dropping to where his fingers had circled her skin. "Zora," he whispered. Her name. He said it for the first time since the crash. It wasn't a statement. It was a question, filled with a fragile, terrifying hope. He was seeing her. Not the nursemaid, not the stranger. Her. And in that charged silence, she knew she was in more danger than ever before. The discovery came by accident. Mina, in her haste to leave after another failed attempt to get Ji-hoon to sign away a piece of his shipping territory, had left her clutch on a side table. Zora found it hours later. It was an innocuous, expensive little bag, but a faint vibration from within caught her attention. It was a second phone, a burner. She knew she shouldn't, that it was a line she could not uncross, but she answered the buzzing call. The voice on the other end was Japanese. Cold and clinical. "The transfer is ready. Once Kwan's signature is on the paper, the port is ours. Has your brother been handled?" Zora's blood turned to ice. She ended the call, her fingers fumbling with the cheap plastic of the phone. It wasn't just a power grab. It was a full-blown betrayal. They were selling him out to the Yakuza, their oldest and most bitter rivals. This was more than just a coup, it was a death sentence for his entire organization, and for him. She felt a presence behind her and spun around. Ji-hoon stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He looked from the burner phone in her hand to the stark fear on her face. "What is it?" he asked. For a split second, she considered telling him. But what could he do? The confused, memory-wiped man would be no match for Mina and her new allies. She had to protect him, which meant she had to play their game. She slipped the phone into the pocket of her hoodie. "It's nothing," she lied, her voice steadier than she felt. A wrong number. The lie felt like a stone in her gut. She was becoming one of them. A creature of secrets and shadows. That night, the stakes escalated. A window in the living room shattered, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the silent penthouse. Zora threw herself to the floor, pulling Ji-hoon down with her. Instinct took over. "Stay down," she hissed. But something was wrong. Ji-hoon wasn't cowering. He moved with a fluid, lethal grace that was utterly at odds with his supposed condition. He rolled, putting his body between her and the broken window, shielding her completely. His eyes scanned the darkness outside, not with confusion, but with the cold, tactical assessment of a general surveying a battlefield. The attack was short-lived, a warning shot from a sniper on a nearby rooftop. But in those few seconds, Zora saw him. The real him. The mask had slipped. When the danger passed, he slumped back against the sofa, the vacant look returning to his eyes, but she couldn't unsee it. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice laced with a convincing tremor. Zora stared at him, her heart pounding. Was it possible? Could he be faking it? The thought was so audacious, so Machiavellian, that it almost made sense. It was exactly the kind of move he would make. A test. A brutal, unforgiving loyalty test. The next day, she put her own plan into motion. She used the burner phone to send an anonymous text to Seo Jun. It was a simple message, containing the details of a secret bank account in the Caymans, an account she knew Mina kept, siphoning money from the family for years. "She's playing you, too," the message read. The Yakuza deal is just for her. It was a gamble, a desperate attempt to turn them on each other. It was a morally gray, manipulative act that the old Zora, the girl from before this life, would never have contemplated. But that girl was gone. In her place was a woman fighting for her husband's life, even if he was lying to her. That evening, the tension in the penthouse was thick enough to choke on. Ji-hoon found her on the balcony, staring out at the glittering sprawl of Seoul. The city lights were a cold comfort. He stood beside her, not speaking for a long time. The silence between them was not empty, it was filled with everything they couldn't say. "They look at you like you're a decoration," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. "A doll. They don't see what you're doing." Her breath caught. This wasn't the amnesiac. This was him, speaking through the cracks in his own performance. It was an acknowledgement. A confession of a different kind. "I'm just trying to keep my husband alive," she replied, her voice tight. He turned to face her, his dark eyes searching hers in the dim light. "My name is Ji-hoon," he said softly, the sound of it a caress. "You say it like it belongs to you." The intimacy of the moment was more dangerous than any bullet. It was a truth delivered in a cage of lies. She had to know. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Right now, in this moment. Who are you?" Before he could answer, her phone rang. It was her old college roommate, a voice from a life that felt a million miles away. But as she answered, the voice on the other end was not her friend's. It was Mina's, sharp and triumphant. "I told you I'd take care of you," Mina hissed. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out what you were doing? My brother may be a fool now, but I am not. Your little games are over." Zora heard a commotion in the background, the sound of a struggle. Then the line went dead. Mina didn't have her friend. It was a threat. A message. She knew Zora was a problem, and now she was coming for her directly. Zora turned to Ji-hoon, real, undiluted fear finally breaking through her composure. The enemy wasn't just at the gates. They were coming for the queen. The attack was not subtle. There was no finesse, no quiet disappearance in the night. They came through the front door. For men, dressed in black, their faces grim. Mina had grown impatient. She wanted Zora gone, and she wanted the last obstacle to her throne removed with brutal finality. They found Zora in the main living area, standing her ground in front of the hallway that led to the master suite, where Ji-hoon was. She had a heavy glass vase in her hands, a pathetic weapon against trained killers, but it was something. Her body was thrumming with adrenaline, her mind racing. This was it. "The girl comes with us," the leader said, his voice flat. "Don't make this difficult." "You're not touching him," Zora said, her own voice trembling only slightly. She was terrified, but she would not let them see it. She would be the shield, for as long as she could. The men advanced. Zora tensed, ready to swing the vase, ready to fight until her last breath. Just as the first man reached for her, a voice cut through the tension, as sharp and cold as breaking ice. "That's far enough." Ji-hoon stood at the end of the hall. He was no longer the confused patient. The vacant expression was gone, replaced by an aura of absolute, lethal authority. The shift was so sudden, so complete, it was like watching a god descend into a mortal body. His eyes, fixed on the men threatening his wife, burned with a cold fire she had not seen since before the crash. The amnesia had vanished in the space of a heartbeat. The intruders froze, their shock palpable. They saw not the broken man they were told to expect, but the ruler of their world, whole and terrible. "You were saying?" Ji-hoon asked, his voice dangerously soft as he took a step forward. The leader recovered first, lunging not at Ji-hoon, but at Zora. It was a fatal mistake. Ji-hoon moved. It wasn't a fight, it was a disassembly. He moved with a surgical precision, a brutal choreography of broken limbs and silenced threats. He dismantled the 4 men in less than a minute. Zora didn't just watch, paralyzed. The moment Ji-hoon engaged the first 2, she acted. She brought the heavy vase down on the arm of the man closest to her, shattering both the glass and bone. She used the chaos he created, fighting with a desperate fury she didn't know she possessed. She was never going to be a passive victim in her own home. When it was over, the penthouse was silent again, save for the ragged sound of their breathing and the groans of the men on the floor. Ji-hoon stood amidst the wreckage untouched. He turned to her, his gaze sweeping over her, checking for any injury. The fire in his eyes softened as he looked at her, at the fierce, terrified woman in the worn gray hoodie, who had stood between him and the wolves. "You were the only one," he said. The words were quiet, but they landed with the weight of a vow. It was everything. An apology, a confession, an absolution. He knew she had suspected. He knew she had held the line anyway. He stepped over one of his former soldiers and walked to her. He didn't touch her, not yet. His eyes fell to the pocket of her hoodie, where he knew she'd kept the burner phone. "I had to know," he said, his voice raw with a pain that had nothing to do with any physical injury. "After my mother, betrayal from my own blood, I could not risk it. I had to burn out the poison." The cost of his test was laid bare in the wreckage around them. He had sacrificed his family, the very people who should have been his strength, to test the loyalty of the one person he had chosen. The poison was gone, but the wounds from the fire would remain. She knew that their life from this point on would be built on this terrible truth, that he was a man who would set his own house ablaze to see who would run out and who would run in. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she had run in. The aftermath was swift and silent. Mina and Seo-jun disappeared. No one asked where they went. Their names were never spoken again. The empire settled back under the iron-fisted rule of its true master. The whispers of weakness were silenced, replaced by a new, more potent fear. The boss had not been weakened, he had been watching. Days later, they stood on the balcony, the city lights of Seoul a river of diamonds below. The broken window had been replaced. The blood had been cleaned from the marble floors. Everything was pristine, as if the violence had never happened. But it had. It lived in the space between them. Ji-hoon came to stand behind her. She could feel the heat of his body, a solid, grounding presence at her back. He still hadn't apologized for the deception, and she knew he never would. Apologies were for men with regrets. Kwon Ji-hoon did not have regrets, he had results. Instead, he gently took her hand, his long fingers lacing through hers. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. It was a gesture of fealty, of reverence. "My empire is yours," he said, his voice a low murmur against her skin. "My life is yours. It always was." Zora didn't answer. She leaned back slightly, resting her head against his chest, feeling the steady, strong beat of his heart. She looked out at the vast, glittering city he commanded. Weeks ago, in a cold hospital room, she had made a choice without even realizing it. She had chosen this man, this life, with all its danger and its darkness. She had been tested and not found wanting. And as the cool night air washed over her, she knew, with a terrifying and exhilarating clarity, that she would choose it all over again.